Get in my carriage now, the Duke told the poor mother of three, and his act shocked all. The rain was falling, the streets of London thick with mud. A hungry widow clutched her children, turned out by her landlord with nowhere to go. Then through the storm rolled a nobleman's carriage. He opened the door, and before the crowd could even blink, he commanded her inside, but what began as an act of mercy became a scandal across the city. Whispers filled the pews, gossip spread through the ballrooms. Why would a powerful duke risk everything for a penniless widow? And what secret from her past could ruin them both? The church bells toll, the torches flare, and society holds its breath. Will this bold act of compassion unite two broken worlds or destroy them forever? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The rain drummed against the cobblestones, each drop another reminder of Clara Harwood's desperate situation. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, trying to shield baby Eliza from the bitter spring chill while keeping a watchful eye on Thomas and Martha. Their meager belongings sat in a trunk beside them, all that remained of their former life after the landlord had thrust them onto the street. Stay close. Thomas, Clara cautioned, as her son peered at a puddle forming near his worn boots. Martha's small fingers twisted in the fabric of her mother's skirt, seeking comfort in the familiar gesture. Baby Eliza's cough, wet and worrying, pierced through the steady patter of rain. The sound of approaching hooves and wheels drew nearer, and Clara tried to pull Thomas back, but the grand carriage was already upon them. Wheels cut through a deep puddle, sending a wave of muddy water that nearly knocked Thomas off his feet. Clara's heart leaped to her throat as she steadied him. The carriage came to an abrupt halt, and Clara found herself staring at the polished boots of a nobleman as he descended. Her eyes traveled upward, taking in the fine cut of his coat, the stern set of his jaw, and the penetrating gaze of Gabriel Alistair Hawthorne. "The Duke of Ashford, get in my carriage now," he commanded, his voice carrying across the street. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them, apprentices pausing in their work, hawkers setting down their wares to watch the scene unfold. Clara hesitated, her mind racing with the impropriety of entering a nobleman's carriage unchaperoned. But Eliza's wheezing grew worse, and Thomas shivered against her side. The crowd's whispers grew louder, and Clara knew this moment would be talked about in each and every shop and tavern by nightfall. "Your Grace, she began, but the Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he glanced at Eliza. "Please," he added, quieter now, meant for her ears alone, with as much dignity as she could muster. Clara nodded. "Thank you, Your Grace." She ushered Martha and Thomas forward, then carefully climbed in with Eliza cradled against her chest. The Duke then followed, giving swift, precise instructions to his coachman. The interior of the carriage was warm, the leather seats soft and dry. Thomas's eyes grew wide at the luxury surrounding them, while Martha sat perfectly still, as if afraid to touch anything. The Duke sat opposite them, his presence filling the small space. When they arrived at Ashford House, Clara's amazement only grew. The grand townhouse loomed before them, its windows gleaming despite the dreary weather. Servants appeared immediately to usher them inside, and Clara found herself and her children being led to a kitchen where hot soup and fresh bread awaited. "Your Grace," Clara said as the Duke moved to leave them in the capable hands of his housekeeper. "I must insist on propriety. Might a maid be assigned as chaperone?" Something like respect flickered in the Duke's eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Harwood. Mrs. Pembroke, please arrange it." He turned to his steward next. "Retrieve their trunk from the street and settle any arrears with the landlord. I want no loose ends. Later that evening." Clara knelt beside the small beds that had been hastily arranged in the attic chamber. Martha and Thomas's faces glowed in the candlelight as they joined her in prayer, while Eliza slept peacefully for the first time that day in his study below. The Duke sat at his desk, penning a carefully worded note to the parish vicar. The letter requested verification of Clara's widowhood, his quills scratching against the fine paper as he composed each line with careful consideration. In the kitchen below, a young scullery maid leaned close to the kitchen boy as she scraped plates clean. Did you hear? She whispered, her eyes bright with gossip. His Grace himself brought them in from the street. A widow and 3 little ones right into Ashford House. The kitchen boy's eyes widened, and Clara would have known, had she been able to hear them, that by morning their story would be spreading through every household in London. The candlelight cast long shadows in the attic as Clara tucked the blankets around her sleeping children. Grateful for their warmth and safety, yet uncertain of what tomorrow might bring, dawn crept over London as St. Paul's bells rang out across the misty morning air. In the attic chamber of Ashford House, Clara Harwood sat straight-backed near the window, her skilled fingers working swiftly at torn household linens. The housemaid Rose stood in the doorway, watching in silence as Clara's needle wove an almost invisible mend through the fine fabric. I thought to make myself useful, Clara explained softly, not looking up from her work. These are quite fine pieces to be left in such disrepair. Rose nodded, impressed despite herself. 'Tis true, miss. I've never seen such neat stitching. Below stairs, the Duke of Ashford sat alone at his massive mahogany breakfast table, absently noting the quiet that filled his usually silent morning routine had changed. Earlier, he'd glimpsed Clara's children in the servants' hall, accepting bowls of porridge with shy thank yous that made even stern-faced Mrs. Branwell's expression soften. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of fretful coughing from above. Baby Eliza's illness had grown worse in the night, and Mrs. Pretty, the motherly housekeeper, had taken charge as soon as she heard the child's distress. Now then, little one, Mrs. Pretty crooned, gathering the infant close. We'll soon set you right. Clara hurried to her baby's side. Please, if I might suggest, boiled water with honey and lemon has helped her before. I would not presume to ask for a physician. Nonsense, Mrs. Pretty declared. His Grace would expect nothing less. I'll send for Dr. Morris directly. She paused, studying Clara's face. Though your tisane sounds sensible enough. We'll try both, shall we? The morning advanced, bringing an unexpected visitor. Lady Eugenia Markham swept into the front hall. Her elegant figure a familiar sight at Ashford House. She carried several leather-bound books and papers, clearly prepared to discuss charitable accounts with her cousin the Duke. Gabriel, I must speak with you about the Almack's subscriptions. She stopped short, hearing a child's clear voice reading from above. Following the sound, Lady Eugenia discovered Clara sitting with Martha in the small attic sitting room, a worn Bible open between them. The girl's careful pronunciation of the Psalms filled the space with quiet dignity. How lovely, Lady Eugenia said, making both mother and daughter start. You've taught her well, Mrs. Harwood. Clara rose quickly, dropping a curtsy. Your ladyship is kind to say so. Lady Eugenia's sharp eyes took in Clara's modest but clean appearance, the careful way she carried herself, and the obvious devotion between mother and child. After a moment's consideration, she made a decision. I was about to attend morning services at St. George's, she said. Perhaps you and your daughter would care to join me? My carriage has plenty of room, and the exercise would do you both good. Clara recognized the offer for what it was. Protection, respectability, a chance to be seen in proper company. We would be honored, my lady. Throughout the day, servants whispered in corners and exchanged meaningful glances. Was Mrs. Harwood a guest? A charity case? How long would she stay? The Duke's unexpected act of kindness had upset the careful balance of the household as evening approached and candles were being lit throughout the house. Mrs. Branwell found Clara in the small sitting room adjacent to the attic chamber. The housekeeper's face was grave. Mrs. Harwood, I feel I must warn you. Word has spread beyond these walls about your arrival here. The gossips are already at work in the markets and drawing rooms. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she folded her mending, but her voice remained steady. I feared as much, Mrs. Branwell. We will not impose upon His Grace's kindness for long. It is no burden, came a quiet voice from the shadows of the doorway. The Duke stood there, his tall figure backlit by the hallway's candlelight. The unexpected gentleness in his tone made Clara's heart flutter strangely, and she found she could not meet his eyes. The Duke himself seemed unsettled by the tenderness that had crept into his voice. And after a moment's charged silence, he gave a slight bow and withdrew, leaving Clara staring at the empty doorway. Her thoughts in turmoil. The Sunday bells of St. James's rang clear across London's fashionable streets. Clara Harwood guided her children down the church steps of St. Martin in the Fields, grateful for Lady Eugenia's steadying presence beside her. Martha's new cotton dress, though plain, was clean and pressed, while Thomas had struggled proudly with his father's old cravat until Clara helped him tie it properly. The baby, wrapped snugly against the spring chill, slept peacefully in her arms. "This way, my dear," Lady Eugenia murmured, steering them toward the rear pews where common folk gathered. Ahead, the Duke of Ashford sat alone in his family's forward pew, his broad shoulders straight beneath his perfectly tailored coat. Clara kept her eyes lowered, conscious of the whispers that followed their progress down the aisle. "Did you see? The seamstress from Holborn, living under his very roof. What can he be thinking?" The disapproving murmurs grew as more of London's elite filtered into the church. Clara focused on Thomas's fidgeting hands, stilling them gently as the vicar began the service. Martha leaned against her mother's side, her small fingers tracing the worn prayer book's pages. Through the sermon, Clara felt the weight of stairs upon her back. She had known there would be talk, a widow with 3 children, taken in by one of England's most eligible dukes. Yet she had not expected such open disdain from those who moments before had bowed there. Heads in Christian prayer. As the congregation filed out after the service, the whispers grew bolder. A cluster of fashionable ladies gathered near the church gate, their silk skirts rustling as they turned to watch Clara pass. "Look at that gown," one woman sneered, loud enough to carry. "Hardly better than a servant's dress." To think she dare show her face here. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, holding Thomas's hand tightly. Lady Eugenia's presence beside her was like a shield, though even her aristocratic bearing could not fully deflect the cutting remarks. Suddenly, a commanding voice cut through the gossip. "If any quarrel with my carriage," the Duke of Ashford declared, his tone ringing with authority, "let them quarrel with my conscience. For I bade this lady and her little ones enter." A shocked silence fell over the churchyard. Clara looked up to find the Duke standing tall before the gathering, his gray eyes fierce with conviction. The fashionable ladies drew back, fans fluttering nervously at this public defense of a common widow. "Your Grace," one gentleman stammered, "surely you understand the delicacy of the situation." "I understand Christian charity," the Duke replied firmly, "and I will not have it questioned." His gaze swept the crowd, challenging any to speak against him. None dared, though the damage was done. His words would race through London's drawing rooms before sunset. That evening, as Clara settled her children for bed in their attic chamber, voices rose from the Duke's study below. Through the floorboards, she could hear Lord Redmayne's cultured tones, sharp with concern. "Gabriel, you cannot be so naive. Your actions today have set all of London talking. Lady Caroline's family is already expressing doubts about the match. I will not apologize." For showing kindness to a widow and her children, the Duke responded, though his voice held a note of weariness. "Kindness? The tongue sees only scandal. A beautiful young widow, 3 children, living under your roof. Think of your position, man. The marriage negotiations we've spent months arranging. That is enough, Redmayne. It is not nearly enough. You have responsibilities, obligations to your title. This charitable impulse threatens everything we've worked for." Clara pressed her hands to her mouth, heart aching. She had never meant to cause such trouble for her benefactor. In the quiet of the attic, Martha's evening prayers seemed to mock her. God bless the Duke for being so kind to us. But London's elite had twisted that kindness into something dangerous, turning Christian mercy into scandal. Clara knew then that their sanctuary at Ashford House had come at a far greater price that she had. Imagine morning light streamed through the studies. Tall windows as Lord Redmayne faced the Duke across his mahogany desk. The older man's fingers drummed against his silver-headed cane, his expression grave beneath carefully powdered hair. "Your Grace, the time has come. Lady, Honoria's family expects an announcement before the season progresses further. Redmayne's, Voice carried the weight of decades of political alliance. The Commons will not look kindly upon distractions. The Duke stood, moving to gaze out at the spring gardens. A man's conscience is his own affair. Redmayne, not when that man holds 3 counties' votes in his hand. Redmayne's tone sharpened. The widow's presence here raises questions. Uncomfortable ones. Before the Duke could respond, a discreet knock interrupted them. His butler appeared, announcing Clara's arrival as requested. She entered, her simple morning dress neat but showing signs of wear. Her composure perfect despite the obvious tension in the room. Mrs. Harwood. Bleh. Duke's voice was carefully neutral. Lord Redmayne was just leaving. Once alone, the Duke gestured Clara to a chair, remaining standing himself. Madam, I must speak plainly. Your presence here has become complicated. Clara's spine stiffened, though her voice remained steady. I understand completely, Your Grace. We shall leave at once. That is not what I meant. He cut her off, pacing before his desk. Political alliances are delicate things. My position requires certain expectations be met. He paused, choosing his words carefully. However, I will not see your children turned out before they are fully recovered. That is non-negotiable. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. Your Grace is too kind, but I cannot allow our presence to damage your standing. A harsh cough from the hallway interrupted her words. Martha appeared in the doorway, face flushed with fever. Mama, she whispered, swaying slightly. The Duke reached her first, steadying the girl with gentle hands. It seems the decision is made for us, he said quietly. You will stay until she is well? Clara rose, gathering Martha close. I am grateful, but it is a matter of practical necessity now, the Duke said firmly. To do otherwise would reflect poorly on my character. And while we wait for her recovery, he hesitated, then continued. I notice both children read well. My library stands idle most mornings. It would be a shame to waste such opportunity. Clara's eyes widened. You would permit them lessons? I would insist upon them. Education is a worthy pursuit for any station. His tone brooked no argument. My secretary can spare an hour each morning. That evening, Clara stood in the shadowed hallway outside the Duke's study, pausing as she heard his measured steps pacing before the fire. His voice, barely audible, reached her ears. The cost of compassion may yet be higher than Parliament's. Taxes, he murmured to himself. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. She had known their presence might cause gossip, but only now did she truly understand the political risk he took by sheltering them. His reputation, his alliances, perhaps even his influence in Parliament, all were threatened by this simple act of Christian charity. She turned away quietly, her heart troubled. The Duke's protection had seemed a miracle that rainy afternoon, but now she saw it might prove his undoing. Yet with Martha's fever rising and Thomas finally showing interest in more than street games, how could she deny her children this chance? The contradiction twisted in her chest like a thorned vine, gratitude and guilt hopelessly entangled Dot in the nursery. Martha slept fitfully while Thomas proudly spelled out words from a primer the Duke's secretary had provided. Clara watched them, her mother's heart both soaring and sinking. They deserved every opportunity, every chance to rise above their circumstances. But at what cost to their benefactor? And how long could this delicate balance last before someone forced them all to face the consequences of the Duke's compassion? A week had passed since the study confrontation. Outside Ashford House, carriages clattered over rain-slicked cobblestones, their elegant occupants bound for Lord Redmayne's grand ball. Inside, Clara knelt beside the Duke's valet in the servants' hall, her skilled fingers racing to mend a tear in his Grace's finest evening coat. A blessing you noticed this, Mrs. Harwood, the valet muttered, holding the fabric taut as Clara's needle flashed in the candlelight. His Grace would never forgive a visible repair. Clara worked swiftly, her stitches invisible against the midnight blue wool. There, she said, snipping the thread. No one shall ever know. The valet hurried away with the mended coat, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. Through the window, she watched the Duke's carriage depart, its polished panels gleaming beneath the street lamps. The sight stirred an unexpected ache in her chest at Lord Redmayne's mansion. Candles blazed in crystal chandeliers as London's finest family swept through the ballroom. Ladies' silk skirts whispered across marble floors, while gentlemen's boots clicked against the parquet. The Duke moved through the crowd with practiced ease, though his thoughts kept straying to the quiet evening he might have spent reading to Clara's children, Lady Honoria. Pennington stood near a gilded mirror, her crimson gown drawing every eye. She watched the Duke through narrowed eyes, noting how distracted he seemed during each quadrille. When he raised his glass for the traditional toast, however, the entire room fell silent. "To our gracious host," the Duke began, his voice carrying clearly. Then, unexpectedly, he continued, "And to the pure hearts of children who teach us gaily what true gratitude means. This very morning, young Thomas and Martha reminded me that kindness deserves kindness in return." A ripple of warmth passed through the assembly. Ladies dabbed their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, while several gentlemen nodded approvingly. The Duke's words painted him as both powerful and paternal, a combination that made him even more appealing as a marriage prospect. But Lady Honoria wasn't fooled. She observed how the Duke's gaze turned inward after his toast, how his thoughts seemed to drift far from the glittering ballroom. She recognized that distant look. She'd seen it before in men caught between duty and desire. "Your Grace seems preoccupied this evening," she murmured when they partnered for a minuet. "Perhaps you left your heart at home?" The Duke's expression remained carefully neutral. "My thoughts are where they ought to be, Lady Honoria." As the evening wore on, the Duke found himself increasingly restless. He departed earlier than was strictly polite, his carriage racing through London's darkened streets. The halls of Ashford House were quiet when he returned, save for the crackle of fire in his study. There he found Clara setting out a tea service by the hearth. She wore a simple gray dress, her hair neatly tied back, yet something about her presence made the room feel warmer than all Redmayne's. Hundreds of candles. You need not have waited. "Up," he said softly. "Children wished to ensure you received their thanks for the new books." Clara poured the tea with steady hands. "Though I suspect you already shared their gratitude this evening." Their fingers brushed as she passed him the cup. Both withdrew quickly, yet the brief contact left them oddly shaken. "How did you know?" he asked. Thomas practiced his speech all afternoon. A gentle smile touched her lips. "He was quite determined you should know how much he appreciated the gift." The Duke settled into his chair, watching the firelight play across Clara's features. She remained standing, proper yet somehow not distant, her presence both soothing and unsettling. "I should bid you good night." "Your Grace," she said at last, though she lingered by the door. "Good night, Mrs. Harwood." His voice was soft, almost tender, as Clara climbed the stairs to her attic chamber. She pressed one hand against her racing heart. Below, the Duke stared into the dying fire, his tea growing cold, unable to name the emotion that made him wish she had stayed. 2 days after Lord Redmayne's ball, morning sunlight streamed through the parlor windows of Ashford House. Clara sat in a modest chair near the window, her needle moving steadily through fine linen as she worked on mending the household linens. The quiet morning peace shattered as the butler announced an unexpected visitor. Lady Honoria Pennington. "Madam," Clara rose quickly, smoothing her simple gray dress as Lady Honoria swept into the room like a peacock entering a dovecote. Her violet silk gown rustled dramatically with each step, and she carried an elaborate hatbox tied with expensive ribbon. "Mrs. Harwood," Honoria drawled, her smile sharp as a needle's point. "How quaint to find you at your needlework. But then one must keep occupied when one has so few social engagements. Your ladyship is most kind to call," Clara replied evenly, offering a proper curtsy. "May I ring for tea?" "Oh, no need for ceremony." Honoria placed the hat box on a nearby table. "I've brought you a small gift. Some remnants from my modiste, lovely silk pieces that might brighten up your..." She paused deliberately, eyes scanning Clara's worn garments. "A wardrobe." Clara's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her sewing. "You are too generous." "My lady, think nothing of it." Honoria began removing lengths of expensive silk in jewel tones that Clara knew would cost months of a seamstress's wages. Though I imagine such fine materials must remind you of better days. Before your dear husband's unfortunate circumstances, Clara's hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. My husband was a good man. Of course he was, dear. Honoria's tone dripped with false sympathy. Such a tragedy, really. Though one does wonder what sort of man leaves his family in such reduced circumstances. My husband's memory deserves respect, Clara said quietly but firmly. Even if our fortunes did not prosper, Honoria's eyes glittered with malice. Oh, but surely there's no shame in simple misfortune. Unless, of course, there was more to the story. Clara stood, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. I thank you for your thoughtful gifts, Lady Honoria. But I have duties to attend to, naturally. Honoria rose, adjusting her gloves. Do keep the silks. Perhaps they'll help you remember what it was like before. Everything. After Honoria's departure, Clara sank back into her chair, her hands shaking as she fought back tears. But she had little time to recover before the house began buzzing with whispers. Honoria had not left empty-handed. A few coins pressed into a kitchen maid's palm had yielded the truth she sought Dot by afternoon. The story had spread through the servants' hall like wildfire. Clara Harwood's husband had died in debtor's prison, a disgrace that would taint any family name. The whispers grew louder with each passing hour, creeping up from below stairs into the main house Dot at supper that evening. The Duke sat at the head of his table, keenly aware of the changed atmosphere. Servants moved about their duties with darting glances and poorly concealed whispers. Clara, who had been permitted to dine in a small family dining room for the children's sake, kept her eyes fixed on her plate, speaking only to quiet little Martha's questions. Thunder rumbled in the distance as rain began to patter against the windows. The Duke observed as a footman nearly dropped a plate when Clara requested the salt, his face flushing with poorly concealed disdain. The butler's usual stoic expression had acquired a slight curl of disapproval at the corners of his mouth. Clara's shoulders remained straight, but her face had grown pale, and she flinched almost imperceptibly at each crack of thunder. The storm outside grew stronger, rain lashing against the windows as if nature itself reflected the turmoil brewing within. Ashford House, Dr. Duke watched it all with growing concern, noting how Clara's fingers trembled as she helped Thomas cut his meat. How she struggled to maintain her composure while the servants' whispers seemed to grow louder than the storm. The weight of unspoken words and judgment hung heavy in the air, as oppressive as the gathering storm clouds outside. The morning mist clung to London streets as messengers hurried between gentlemen's clubs and coffee houses, carrying more than just letters and papers. They carried whispers, dangerous whispers that grew louder with each telling. By the time the Duke's secretary entered his study, the damage was done, Your Grace, the man said, his voice careful. There are rumors circulating about Mrs. Harwood. The Duke looked up from his correspondence, his quill pausing mid-stroke. Speak plainly. They're calling her the debtor's widow in the clubs. Your Grace, the story of her husband's death in prison is spreading through every coffeehouse from St. James's to Cheapside. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His secretary, sensing the storm brewing beneath his master's calm exterior, bowed and retreated from the room. Upstairs, Clara had already heard. The servants' whispers had reached her ears, and her heart felt heavy with shame. She stood in the attic room that had been her sanctuary, carefully folding the few clothes they owned into their battered trunk. Thomas helped her while Martha cradled the baby, who was finally recovering from his cough. Must we go, Mama? Martha whispered, her young face pinched with worry. Clara smoothed her daughter's hair. Yes, my dear. We've imposed upon His Grace's kindness far too long. When the trunk was packed, Clara gathered her children and made her way downstairs. In the servants' hall, she found Mrs. Branwell directing the morning's tasks. Mrs. Branwell, Clara said softly. The housekeeper turned, her stern face softening slightly at the sight of Clara and her children. I wanted to thank you for your kindness these past weeks. You've shown us more charity than we deserve. Double quotes. Mrs. Brenwell's eyes darted to the packed trunk. You're leaving then? Yes, the parish poorhouse will shelter us until I can find work. Clara's voice remained steady. Though her heart trembled, the housekeeper pressed her lips together, looking as though she wished to speak, but only nodded. God be with you, Mrs. Harwood. Clara led her children through the servants' passages one last time, wanting to slip away quietly. But as they reached the entry hall, the Duke emerged from his study. He stopped short at the sight of them, his face growing pale. Mrs. Harwood, he said, his voice rough. What is the meaning of this? Clara curtsied, keeping her eyes lowered. Your Grace, I cannot remain here. The rumor's your reputation. Hang my reputation. He began, then caught himself, glancing at the servants hovering nearby. Please, Clara whispered. You've shown us more kindness than we could ever repay. I won't see your name tarnished because of us. Because of my husband's, because of my shame. The Duke took a step forward, then stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. There's no shame in misfortune, madam. There is shame in bringing scandal to those who show you mercy. Clara's voice broke slightly. The Tun will never forgive you for harboring us. Lady Honoria. Clara? He said so softly only she could hear, and the use of her Christian name made her heart ache. She forced herself to meet his eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch, longing, pain, and something deeper that neither dared name. The Duke opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, trapped between what duty demanded and what his heart desired. Rain had begun to fall outside, drumming against the windows. Clara gathered her children close. God bless you, Your Grace, she whispered, and turned toward the door. The footman opened it, letting in the sound of rain and the clatter of carriages on cobblestones. Clara stepped out into the gray morning, holding Martha's hand while Thomas carried the baby. They had no umbrella, but she hardly felt the rain. Behind them, the Duke stood in the doorway, a figure carved from stone. He watched as Clara and her children made their way down the steps, their small forms growing indistinct in the rain. His hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles turned white, but he remained silent, torn between the demands of his position and the cry of his heart. The last glimpse Clara had of Ashford House was of the Duke's tall figure in the doorway, as still as a statue. As the rain fell between them like a veil, morning light filtered through Westminster's tall windows as the Duke of Ashford entered Parliament. The usual bustle of peers and politicians filled the chamber, but today their whispers carried a sharper edge. As he made his way to his customary seat, scattered laughter and pointed glances followed in his wake. Lord Redmayne appeared at his elbow, pressing a crumpled paper into his hand. They're everywhere this morning, he muttered. Every coffee house from here to Temple Bar. The Duke smoothed the pamphlet, his expression hardening as he read. Crude drawing showed a nobleman clearly meant to be himself dancing. Attendance on a weeping widow while coins spilled from her pockets. The caption beneath proclaimed, "The Duke's new charity, housing debtors one widow at a time." He folded the paper with deliberate care, tucking it into his coat. Around him the chamber filled with the rustle of similar pamphlets being passed hand to hand, accompanied by poorly concealed snickers as debate began over grain tariffs. The usual attention to policy was lacking. Instead, sideways comments and thinly veiled jests about charitable dukes and widow's mercy peppered the discussion. The Duke sat silent, his jaw tight as barbs flew. Lord Hastings, the notorious gossip, raised his voice during a lull. Perhaps we should consider special taxation for those who harbor debtors. Some among us seem eager to shelter such unfortunate cases. Laughter rippled through the chamber. The Duke's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Indeed, another peer called out. Though surely housing one widow is cheaper than maintaining a proper mistress. The chamber erupted in jeers. The Duke rose slowly to his feet, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. Silence fell as he stepped into the center aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "My lords," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed chamber. "You speak of things you do not understand. You mock virtue because you cannot recognize it. You scorn true nobility because it shames your own pretense of it. He turned in a slow circle, meeting the startled gazes of his peers. Mrs. Clara Harwood is the truest lady I have ever known. Her grace shines not through idle wealth, but through the dignity with which she bears life's burdens. Her nobility manifests not in titles, but in the tender care she shows her children, the quiet strength with which she faces each day, and the unwavering faith that guides her steps. The chamber remained frozen, every face fixed on the Duke as he continued, his voice ringing with conviction. You who mock her circumstances have never known the courage it takes to stand alone against misfortune. You who laugh at her poverty have never witnessed the richness of her character. She has more genuine worth in her smallest kindness than can be found in all your coffers combined. Lord Hastings half rose, sputtering. The Duke's raised hand silenced him. Mock me if you wish, my lords. Question my judgment. Challenge my decisions. But know this when you mock a widow's distress. When you make sport of a mother's struggle to protect her children, you reveal nothing about her character and everything about your own. Without waiting for response, the Duke strode from the chamber. His boots struck the floor like hammer blows in the stunned silence. Not until the heavy doors closed behind him did the shocked whispers begin. He maintained his rigid composure through the halls of Westminster, past bowing servants and staring politicians. Only when he reached his waiting carriage did his shoulders sag slightly, the cost of his public declaration settling over him. Home, he ordered his driver, sinking into the padded seat as London rolled past his windows. The city's familiar sights blurred together as his mind raced, reviewing his words, considering their consequences, and always returning to thoughts of Clara. That evening, he paced his study as the fire burned low. The magnitude of what he had done, the bridges he had burned, the alliances he had strained, all of it weighed heavily. Yet, when he thought of Clara's gentle strength, her quiet dignity, he felt no regret as the last candle guttered. He made his decision. Striding to the bell pull, he summoned his butler. Have my carriage ready at first light, he commanded, and send word to the stables that we leave at dawn. The butler bowed. Your destination, your grace? The Duke's voice was firm with resolve. Wherever I must go to find Mrs. Harwood. I have words that must be spoken, and I will not rest until she hears them. The morning sun cast weak shadows through the parish hall's grimy windows. Clara sat on a hard wooden bench, gently rocking baby Eliza, whose cough had worsened in the damp air. The poorhouse's chill seeped through Clara's thin dress as she listened to Martha's clear voice reading from their treasured Bible. The Lord is my shepherd. Martha read carefully, her finger tracing each word. I shall not want. Around them the parish's poor huddled on benches or shuffled past with bowls of thin porridge. The air hung heavy with despair and unwashed bodies. Clara pulled Eliza closer, trying to warm the infant's tiny hands. Thomas sat quietly at her feet, drawing shapes in the dust with a stick. The sudden echo of boots on stone made Clara look up. A messenger in the Duke's livery appeared in the doorway, his fine coat startling against the hall's grime. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, he announced, voice ringing through the hushed space. Clara's heart lurched as Gabriel strode in, his tall figure commanding yet somehow hesitant. The poor folk pressed back against the walls, creating a path. But instead of the proud noble they expected, they saw something extraordinary about the Duke of Ashford, one of England's most powerful peers, drop to his knees before Clara's bench. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Even the ancient chaplain stopped mid-prayer to stare. Clara, Gabriel said, his voice rough with emotion. I have been a fool and a coward. Will you forgive me? She gazed down at him, scarcely breathing. His dark eyes held none of their usual guardedness, only raw sincerity, and something deeper that made her tremble. Your Grace, she whispered, please rise. This is most improper. No. He shook his head firmly. I kneel because it is right. Because you are worth far more than my pride. Because I love you, Clara Harwood. The words echoed in the stunned silence. Martha's Bible slipped from her fingers. Thomas crept closer to his mother's skirts. I love your gentle strength, Gabriel continued. Your dignity in hardship, your devotion to these precious children. I love how you've taught me that true nobility lies in character, not birth. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as he took her free hand in his. I ask you now, before God and these witnesses, will you be my wife? Not from charity or duty, but because you are my heart's equal and my soul's match? Clara could barely see through her tears. All around them, the poor folk watched with wonder as social barriers crumbled before love's power. Even baby Eliza had gone quiet, as if sensing the moment's importance. Your reputation, Clara managed. The scandal means nothing without you, Gabriel finished firmly. I've lived by society's rules all my life. But loving you has taught me that God's law of compassion matters more than man's law of class. Martha pressed close to her mother's side, hope shining in her young face. Thomas reached out to touch the Duke's fine coat sleeve with wondering fingers. Clara looked into Gabriel's eyes and saw their future, not a life of scandal and whispers, but one of love transforming society's cold hearts, of mercy triumphing over judgment, of their children growing up knowing that worth came from character, not privilege. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, I will be your wife. Joy blazed across Gabriel's face as he rose, lifting her hand to his lips. The watching crowd burst into cheers and blessings. Even the chaplain wiped away tears as he raised his hands in benediction. The poorhouse bells began to toll, their bronze voices singing out across London's rooftops. Gabriel helped Clara gather the children, wrapping his own coat around Eliza against the spring chill. This time, when they walked to his waiting carriage, Clara held her head high. The Duke of Ashford handed his future Duchess into the carriage with tender care, then lifted each child after her. Martha clutched her Bible close, while Thomas bounced with excitement on the velvet seats. As Gabriel settled beside them, Clara felt his hand find hers. The carriage pulled away from the parish hall, its wheels rattling on cobblestones as the bells continued their joyful pealing. Behind them, the poor folk lined the street, waving and calling blessings on this love that had overcome all barriers. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Paul's Cathedral, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor. The gathered congregation murmured as the banns of marriage were read for the third and final time, announcing the intended union between His Grace, Gabriel Alistair Hawthorne, Duke of Ashford, and Mistress Clara Harwood. Among the pews, nobles shifted uncomfortably, their silk rustling with disapproval. But the common folk who filled the back of the cathedral smiled warmly, seeing hope in this marriage that bridged society's deepest divide. Clara stood at the cathedral doors in a simple ivory gown, its clean lines and fine stitching showing her seamstress's skill. Martha and Thomas flanked her sides in their best clothes, while little Eliza, now recovered from her illness, dozed contentedly in Martha's arms. Clara lifted her chin, ready to walk toward her future with dignity. The organ's deep notes filled the vast space as Clara proceeded down the aisle. Gabriel waited at the altar, his eyes never leaving her face. When she reached him, he took her hand with gentle reverence that spoke louder than any words. Candlelight flickered across the altar as they exchanged their vows. Gabriel's voice rang clear and strong. I take thee not despite thy station, but for thy courage, thy dignity, and thy noble heart. What God hath blessed in character, let no man judge by birth. At the wedding feast in Ashford House, Gabriel broke with tradition. Nobles found themselves seated beside maids, while footmen dined next to baronets. The Duke himself led Clara to the head table, where Lady Eugenia waited with open arms. My dear sister, Eugenia said warmly, embracing Clara. How you have opened all our eyes to true worth. The older woman's acceptance brought tears to Clara's eyes, marking the final seal of society's blessing dot as dusk painted the sky in soft purples. Gabriel led his new wife into the gardens. Martha, Thomas, and Eliza darted among the rose bush, their laughter floating on the evening air. The scent of summer blooms filled the peaceful moment. Your quiet strength changed everything, Gabriel murmured, drawing Clara close. You taught me that love's truth matters more than society's rules. Clara smiled up at him, finally free of shame. And he taught me that worth lies in the heart, not in titles or fortune. Across London, church bells began to toll, their joyful music spreading from tower to tower. The sound wrapped around the new family like a blessing, promising not just their happiness, but a new dawn of hope for all who dared to love across society's boundaries dot in the garden's growing twilight. Clara watched her children playing while her husband's hand held hers. The bells continued their song, sealing their union with bronze voices that echoed across the city's rooftops and into history itself. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.